What I'm going to talk about today is how to represent part-whole hierarchies in neural networks. I just want to check that you can hear me okay. Is the audio visual okay?
Both are okay, Professor.
Good.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use 3 recent advances in neural networks and combine them into a design for a system. Now, what I'm going to talk about is a system that hasn't yet been implemented. We've implemented little bits of it, but the whole system hasn't been implemented. So it's just vaporware at present. But these 3 ideas seem to me to fit together very naturally. And I'll explain the 3 ideas. The first idea is transformers, which are mainly used for modeling natural language in systems like BERT, but can also be used for modeling images. The second idea is unsupervised learning of visual representations by maximizing agreement, and I'll explain that. And the third idea is generative models of images that use implicit functions or neural fields, and I'll explain those too. And I'm going to combine those 3 things into a system called Glom. And the point of Glom is to recognize objects, but to work in a way that's much more similar to human perception. So I'm going to start by spending quite a lot of time convincing you that when people perceive objects, they use coordinate frames, and they use rectangular coordinate frames, and they parse objects into part-whole hierarchy. So most people think rectangular coordinate frames are used by mathematicians, but not by your visual system. But I'm going to show you your visual system uses them. And I'm going to do this by using an old demonstration that I invented in 1979. Now, in order to get the full benefit of this, you actually have to do this task yourself. So I'm going to stand back a bit from the camera and try and talk a bit louder. And I want you to follow this task. And then when I ask you, you're going to have to point some things out. So I want you to imagine on a tabletop in front of you, there's a cube, and it's sitting on a tabletop in the normal orientation. And from your point of view, there's a front, bottom, right-hand corner here, and a top back left-hand corner here. And those corners are joined by a body diagonal that goes through the center of the cube. Okay, now keeping that front corner on the tabletop, I want you to take this finger and rotate it so the cube, so that axis is now vertical. That body diagonal becomes vertical. Okay, so now you've got one corner of the cube on the tabletop, one corner of the cube where your top finger is. And now what you have to do is with the finger that was by the bottom corner of the cube, point out where the other corners of the cube are. So you've got one at the bottom, one at the top, and you just have to point to where the other ones are. Okay, so do that now and actually do it, otherwise you won't get the benefit. And then I'll tell you what most of you did. Most of you pointed out 4 other corners. Now, I know this because I've done this experiment on people a lot of times. If you imagine a cube in the normal orientation, you'll see there's 8 corners. So what happened to the other 2 corners? And the fact is that if I force you to use an unfamiliar coordinate system for a cube, where you take that body diagonal and use that as the axis of the cube, you have no idea where the parts of a cube are. I'm going to show you now where the parts of the cube are. So I hope you can see this. This is a cube. And you can see the other corners form a zigzag ring. So I have a picture of it. Oops. It won't let me advance my slides. I have to use Zoom. Okay, there's the picture. So those colored rods are the edges of the cube that don't connect to the 2 corners, the top corner and the bottom corner. And so you can see there's 3 flaps there, a green flap, a blue flap, and a red flap that slope upwards and outwards and make a kind of crown. And the vertices of those flaps all connect to the top corner. And then the 3 lowest corners there all connect to the bottom corner of the cube. Now that's a structure that's completely different from the familiar cube. it's a structure that has a threefold axis of rotational symmetry, whereas a cube has a fourfold axis of rotational symmetry. And basically, unless you're a crystallographer, you are very unused to thinking about a cube like this. So I'll show you what most people point out. Most people, when they're asked to point out the corners, say here, 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 and here. They point out 4 corners, roughly in a square. And what they're doing is they're preserving the symmetries of a cube. What they know about a cube is it's got a 4-fold rotational symmetry about its normal axis. And so they assume the corners are going to come in 4s like that. But the shape they actually point out is, you can think of it, if you have corners here, 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 and here, you can think of it as a square-based pyramid with one corner on top, and another square-based pyramid with a vertex on the bottom. So it's 2 square-based pyramids stuck base to base. I'll call that a hexahedron. Sorry, that's an octahedron. That's an octahedron. And that thing has 8 faces and 6 corners. Unlike the cube, which has 8 corners and 6 faces. In fact, the thing that most people point out is the dual of a cube if you substitute corners for faces and faces for corners. And so I think what's going on is this. When I ask you to point to where the other corners of the cube are, and you're using this unusual coordinate frame that you don't normally use for a cube, you fall back on your most basic knowledge of a cube, which is that it's got this 4-fold rotational symmetry, and you make up a shape that has the same symmetries as a cube when it's in its normal orientation, and that's what you point out. That says that symmetry structure is very important in our understanding of shapes. But it also says we use coordinate frames, and if I force you to use one you're not used to, you have no idea where the bits are. So that's one way that the diagram here, with the green flap, the blue flap, and the red flap, is one way of seeing those 6 edges that form the middle of the cube in this unusual orientation. There's another way to see the same 6 edges. So you can see them like that. I've just colored them differently. The green flap's the same. You can see them as a green flap that slopes up, and a red flap now that slopes downwards and outwards, and a central rectangle, and you just have the 2 ends of the rectangle. Those are the 2 blue lines. Now, when you see it like that, it's a completely different percept. You don't even know it's the same thing. And if you're seeing it like this, and now you close your eyes, and I ask you, are there any parallel lines? You're very well aware that the 2 blue lines are parallel. And you're not at all aware that one of the green lines is parallel to one of the red lines. Not when you're parsing it as a zigzag, like this. So what's happening here is the very same arrangement of edges can be seen in 2 quite different ways, and they don't correspond to different depth orderings, like in the Necker cube. So 2 people who see it different ways don't disagree on what's there. They just have completely different ways of representing it. So the zigzag representation is just a completely different representation from the crown representation. A long time ago, in the age of symbolic AI, we would represent those 2 parsings of those edges like this. When you see the 3 flaps forming a crown, I could make a little tree structure. The whole thing is a crown. It's got 3 major constituents, which are the flaps, and each constituent has 2 parts, which are the 2 edges. There's a relationship between the crown and the green flap. And that relationship, which I've represented here, the spatial relationship, I've represented it as RWX. That's actually the coordinate transform between the intrinsic rectangular frame you impose on the crown and the intrinsic frame you impose on the green flap. And so the way you can represent spatial relationships is actually as a coordinate transform, which is just can be represented by a matrix. Doesn't have to be, but it can be. And so in this tree, what you've got is you've got nodes representing the whole thing and its parts and its subparts. And on the arcs, you've got matrices representing relationships between the intrinsic frame of the whole and the intrinsic frame of the part. If we take the zigzag interpretation, it looks like this. You can represent it in the same way, but of course the nodes are different and it groups the edges differently. One other thing is, if you've got a representation like this, you can do one more thing, which is you can associate with each of the nodes the relationship between that node and the viewer. That is the relationship of that node to your retina or to the camera, if you're doing computer vision. And that's what I put in that blue box. And so those blue boxes, if you take a structural description and you add those blue boxes, you can think of that as what a mental image is like. Whenever you have a mental image, it always has a viewpoint. It's a curious thing, that, but I'm going to convince you of that too now. I'm going to give you a little mental imagery task. And the mental imagery task is a very simple task, and it goes like this. You're going to make a journey. So you go 1 mile east, and then you go 1 mile north, and then you go 1 mile east again. And now what's your direction back to your starting point? And that's a fairly easy task. It's sort of mainly west, but a little bit south, right? But here's something I can tell you that you did. When you imagined that, you imagined something at about this scale, like that and like that. You definitely didn't imagine something at this scale, like that and like that and like that. So for some reason, you imagined it at some particular scale, some sensible scale. You also didn't imagine it like this. You didn't imagine going like that and then like this and then like that. You imagined it with east-west being horizontal. Now, the question is, why did you do that? Why do you have to imagine it in a particular orientation and at a particular scale in order to solve the task? And the answer is, whenever you form a mental image, you associate viewpoint information with the nodes in a structural description. I'm not going to dwell on that anymore. So one thing to notice is a convolutional neural network, which is our current best way of recognizing objects, doesn't have these properties. It doesn't use intrinsic coordinate frames, at least not explicitly. And it doesn't have the property that it can have two completely different percepts of the same object, whereas people do. So convolutional nets are very different from people. They use fine texture information for identifying things, and they don't use as much of the spatial relationships between parts as we do. And that's why they can make very different mistakes from us. What I want to do is get neural networks that recognize things the same way we do. And there's a basic problem, which is every time you see a new image, you get a new parse tree. It might contain a different number of objects related differently with differently related parts. And so somehow you have to be able to represent this parse tree in a neural net. And I'm actually interested in how you would represent it in the real brain. And here's something we know about the real brain, at least we think we know. What a neuron does is determined by the weights of its connections, and those can't change rapidly. So what you can't do is dynamically on the fly, when you see an image, grab a bunch of neurons and say, okay, you neurons will represent this node, and these other neurons will represent that node. You can't dynamically assign neurons to tasks like that. What a neuron does is determined by its weights, and that's what it's good for. So the question is, how can a static neural net represent a parse tree which is different for every image? And that's the basic question this talk is designed to answer. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about transformers. I'm going to tell you very briefly how transformers work. And transformers have an interesting property. So most standard neural nets, in order to activate a neuron, they take the scalar product of a vector of activities of neurons in the layer below and a vector of weights of neuron. Someone's got their sound turned on. And what you do then is you take this scalar product and put it through a nonlinearity, and that activates the neuron. So you're multiplying an activity vector by a weight vector. That's not very good at capturing covariance structure in an image. There's a different way of activating neurons where you multiply an activity vector by an activity vector, and that's used to activate neurons. And that gives you quite different properties. And that's what transformers do. So here's a very simple convolutional net that's designed to disambiguate the meanings of words. So let's suppose we have 4 words in a string, a very short sentence, and suppose the third word is may, and suppose we don't have capitals. So we don't know whether may is a month, or whether it's a modal like would and should, or whether it's a woman's name. And just looking at the word won't tell you. It's the context that tells you. So one way you might try and use a convolutional neural net, a one-dimensional convolutional net, to disambiguate words, is you might have multiple levels of representation of the same word. So we have an initial representation where we take the symbol for the word, the symbol for may, and we convert that into a vector. I'll call that a word vector. And that vector is ambivalent about whether it's a month or a woman's name or a modal. You just can't tell from the word itself. Then what we want to do is refine that vector. So at the next level up, that third word vector along at the second level, we want to be a representation of the word may that's used some information from the context. So in a convolutional net, what we would do is we would get the vectors that represent the nearby words to provide some input, and the activation of that third word vector at the second level up would be based on the activation that word vector had in the previous layer and the activations of nearby word vectors. And that way we just make some progress in disambiguating the word vector. But transformers do something much more powerful. It's also more complicated, and I'm just going to explain it very briefly. In a transformer, what you do is you say, I don't want all the neighboring words to have equal importance in determining my meaning. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look for neighboring words that seem relevant to my meaning, and those neighboring words I'm going to allow to refine my meaning, but other words that are irrelevant, I'm not going to allow them to. And the way it does that is quite complicated. It gets each word vector to create 3 new vectors, a query, a key, and a value. And let's just focus on that third word vector. So that's created a query, a key, and a value. And that query that it's created is then matched to the keys for all nearby words. So you take the vector of activities that represents the query for the third word, and you match it to the key for the second word and the key for the first word, and so on. And the match is just a scalar product. But once you've done the match, you exponentiate that scalar product. So you take the key times the query, and you take e to the power of that. And what that means is, if there's a key that matches well, it'll get a much bigger match than keys that don't match well. And now what you do is you say, the values associated with those other word vectors are allowed to contribute to my new meaning at the second level, the refined meaning of the word may, but they only contribute in proportion to e to the key times the query. So if there's a good match, it contributes a lot, and if there's a bad match, it contributes almost nothing. So for example, if you had if the 2 previous words were 13th of, if you see 13th of May, you're pretty confident May is a month. So the query would need to match things like 13th. If you match a number nearby, that makes you far more likely to be a month. Now, I could give a whole lecture about how transformers work. That's just all I'm going to tell you for now. And I'm going to use transformers in a much simpler way later on. The second new idea in neural nets I want to introduce, actually I introduced this in 1992, but other people rediscovered it and now it's a new idea. It's contrastive self-supervised learning. And the idea is to try and extract representations of what's going on in an image without requiring any labels, because it's hard work to label 1 million images, and you'd like to be able to learn to represent what's going on in an image just by looking at the images. And I'm going to describe one particular recent version of that called SimClear, which works very well. There's a new version, SimClear 2, which works even better, but I'll just describe the standard SimClear, and I'll describe it very briefly. So the idea is you take an image X, and then you take 2 different crops of the image, so different regions of the image that may well overlap, and those are Xi and Xj, okay? So you have a way of transforming images by taking crops, and we also change the color balance so it can't cheat. And then you take those 2 crops of the image, Xi and Xj, and you put each of them through exactly the same neural network. So it's a deep neural network, it's a ResNet, a net designed for recognizing objects, but it's not getting any labels at present. You stick it through many layers of a ResNet, and that's what that F function is. It's a 50-layer neural net, and you get a representation of Xj, which is called Hj. At the same time, you take Xi, and you stick it through the same neural net, a different copy of the same neural net, and you get a representation of Xi, which is Hi. You then project those representations down to a lower dimensionality, and I won't go into why you do that, through some projection function G. And so now you have 2 vectors, Zi that you got from Xi and Zj that you got from Xj. And you're going to learn by trying to make those 2 vectors agree, by trying to make those 2 vectors as similar as possible. Now, if that's all you did, it would learn very quickly to make both of those vectors 0 all the time. And it would say, hey, I got perfect agreement. Whenever you give me 2 crops, I can turn them into vectors that agree perfectly, namely the all 0 vector, or any constant vector. And that's not really what you mean by agreement. What we mean by Xi and Xj having representations that agree is that the representation Zi of Xi should be very similar to the representation Zj of Xj, but it should also be different from the representations of all sorts of things it shouldn't be the same as. So what we do is we take 2 crops from the same image, and we say the Zi and Zj should match. And we take 2 crops from different images, and we say the Zi and Zj shouldn't match. And that's how contrastive representation learning works. And back in 1992, we got it to work a bit. Now computers are much faster and data sets are much bigger, and there's a slightly better method, and the neural nets are much deeper. And now it works really well. So after you've done unsupervised learning to learn the representations of image crops, then you can just take those representations and fit a linear classifier. That is, you just have weights directly connecting it to the classes, and you learn those weights. And it does as well as a deep neural network that's trained with labels. But almost all the training was done with no labels. You just use the labels right at the end. Okay, so when we do contrastive learning, what we do is we take 2 patches from the same image, 2 crops of the same image, and we say they should agree. But that's not really the right thing to do. It works, but it's not the right thing to do. It'd be fine if we wanted to recognize scenes, because if you take any patch from a scene, it's a patch of the same scene. But if you take 2 patches from the same scene, they don't necessarily contain the same object. And if we're trying to recognize objects, we don't want them to match if they contain different objects. So for example, if we take a patch in one image, and it contains parts of objects of class A and class B, and we take another patch, and it contains objects of class A and class C, we don't want the whole patch that contains A and B to match the whole patch that contains A and C. We want to use some kind of attention. We want the part of the patch that contains A in the first crop to match with the part of the patch that contains A in the second crop. but for the parts that contain B and C not to match. And that's what this new architecture I call Glom is designed to do by using something like a transformer. So the original motivation for doing this matching of patches was to find properties that are spatially coherent across space or across time. In Glom, we're going to discover spatial coherence by learning the part-whole hierarchy. And the kind of spatial coherence we're going to discover is that if you see a nose and if you see a mouth, and if they're in the right relationship to make a face, then they're spatially coherent. So before I introduce the Glom architecture, I want to make a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is that Glom isn't meant to be a model of the whole of vision. So vision is basically a sampling process. You don't process the whole image all at once. You look at some place and a small region there you see in very high resolution with your fovea. And then the rest of it you see in much lower resolution. And the outer loop of vision consists of looking around in an intelligent way to sample the bits of the image that are going to give you the information you need to perform some task. And each time we fixate a different part of the image, we reuse the same neural hardware. Now, this talk is only going to be about what happens the first time you fixate somewhere in an image. And it's not going to talk about that whole sequence of fixations. It's what happens on that first fixation when you use that neural hardware once. If you think about how you might represent a part-whole hierarchy, in symbolic AI, what you do is very easy. Because you have computers that have random access memory, you can create new symbols, which basically correspond to memory addresses. And so you can set aside a little piece of the memory for a node in the part-whole hierarchy, and you can put pointers there, so it points to the other nodes. That's basically what you do in symbolic AI. My first attempt to do this with neural nets, which cannot dynamically allocate hardware, I called capsules. And the idea there was, since we can't dynamically allocate hardware, we'll allocate it in advance. And we'll allocate small groups of neurons to all possible nodes in all possible positions. And almost all of those groups will be inactive. And then when an image comes along, we'll activate the subset we need, and we'll hook them up using a routing algorithm. And we managed to make that work, but it's not very efficient. In Glom, we're going to have a quite different way of representing part-whole hierarchies, and we're going to represent them by using islands of agreement. I'll give you a picture of that in a minute. First of all, I'm going to give you a biological inspiration. So the cells in your body are extremely wasteful in the sense that every cell has instructions on how to do everything. So all your brain cells contain within them the instructions for how to be a liver cell. It seems like a terrible waste because they're busy being brain cells, but it's very convenient because it means whenever they want to do something, all the information they might want to consult is there. They don't have to have contention with other brain cells to read things. Now, the environment that a cell is in, the chemicals it receives, the chemical and electrical environment it's in, determine what proteins it actually expresses, which bit of the DNA it actually expresses. And so the way cells differ is by the vector of protein expressions, which proteins they're expressing. And all the cells within one organ are typically expressing similar proteins. So kidney cells will all express a whole bunch of proteins that are the same for all kidney cells. So the way that maps onto vision is like this. The cells in the body are going to be like locations in the image, small patches of image. It's the locations that correspond to cells. The weights of the neural nets are obviously like the DNA, and we're going to have a convolutional kind of net where weights are replicated all across the image, just like they're replicated in cells. And the complete vector of neural activities centered on a location is like the vector of protein expressions in a cell. And objects are like organs. We want all the locations that are part of an object to have similar vectors of activity. At least we want them to have similar vectors of activity at the object level. That'll become clearer in a minute. So here is the Glom architecture. The idea is that at each location, we have separate hardware. So instead of allocating hardware to things like a nose or a mouth, we're going to allocate hardware to a location. And what's more, we're going to allocate multiple levels of hardware. So we're going to have some hardware that's for representing the object of that location. And other hardware, let's suppose that's the level L+1 hardware. Other hardware that's for representing the major part of that location. So it might be a nose, for example. Other hardware for representing a subpart, that might be a nostril, for example. And so that's what the levels are going to be doing. And this diagram is entirely for one location. And we're going to treat a static image as if it was a very boring video, because this hardware is basically designed for processing video. And the way it processes a static image is you just keep giving it the same frame at successive times. So let's suppose we have a static image. And in the bottom left-hand corner there, we give it frame 1. And let's suppose level L-1 is the lowest level of the system. So from the image pixels to level L-1, there might be a little convolutional net that's just representing what's going on in location X, some little patch of the image, which I'll call location X. And it's representing what subpart there is there. Then at the next level up, we want to represent what major part there is there. So if the lower level thing was a nostril, at the higher level, we want to represent something like a nose. And the next level up, we want to represent something like a face. Now, if you look at the middle level, level L, and look at the right-hand box, you can see that the activity vector in level L, when frame 4 arrives, so at time 4, is going to be determined by 3 different things in this picture. It's determined by that blue arrow that's bottom up. So it's determined by the subpart that you found at that location at the previous time step. And that'll actually be a neural network. It'll be a neural network with a couple of hidden layers in it that takes a subpart and tries to predict what the larger part is. That's that blue arrow going upwards. Also at the previous time step, you might have found a larger thing like a face at a higher level. You might have discovered that at this location, the probable object is a face. And so if you know what the face is like, then you can predict where the nose ought to be. So there'll be a top-down prediction via that red arrow, and that'll be a neural network too, which has a couple of hidden layers. There's also a green arrow which says what you expect to find at this level is what you found at the previous time step. We're integrating information over time. And there's one other source of information that isn't shown here, because this diagram is showing you all the interactions that go on within a single location. So this is like what's going on inside one cell. In addition to this, there's the interactions between locations, and those aren't shown in this diagram. So the 4 things that determine the level and embedding are the 3 things that I already talked about. And then number 3 there is an attention-weighted average of what's going on at level L in other nearby locations. So you've got all these locations, they're all interacting. Each location is trying to figure out what its subpart is, what its part is, what its whole is. But it's also looking at what the other locations have decided at the same level, and it's trying to agree with them. But it doesn't try and agree with all the nearby locations. It just tries to agree with ones that are similar to it. That's like a transformer, but a very simple form of transformer, where you're just saying, I'm going to try and be similar to my neighbors if they're already similar to me. It's like a little echo chamber. The echo chamber is going to be very useful in vision. It's a very bad idea in politics, but it works well in vision. So what we hope to see is this. What I'm showing you now is a completely different kind of diagram. Each column now is a different location. And the boxes within a column are like the levels I was showing you. So the second level down is the object level, let's suppose. And the third level down is the part level. And so what's going on within one column is what was happening at a location. And that's what I was showing you over time in the previous diagram. This is just showing you for one particular time. And what we hope to see is this. Obviously, what these boxes have is high dimensional vectors. That is, vectors that have thousands of dimensions. But I'm going to show those in this diagram by two-dimensional vectors. That's enough to show whether things agree. And what we hope to see in Glom, after it's seen multiple frames of a static image, is that at the object level, there'll be a whole bunch of nearby frames, nearby locations that agree on what the object are. And they actually have an identical vector there. Those same locations don't all agree at the part level. At the part level, some of those locations, the ones with the red arrow, they'll agree, and they might all be representing, for example, a nose. These three locations all agree that they're representing a nose. What's more, they all agree that it's exactly the same nose, because that red arrow is going to contain not just things like the color of the nose, but it's going to contain the relationship of the nose to the camera. So it's going to contain the size and orientation and the scale, orientation, and position of the nose relative to the camera. And all three locations can agree on what the position of this nose is relative to the camera. So it's not just a kind of abstract representation that says nose, it's a precise representation of this particular nose. Similarly for the green arrows, which are going to represent a mouth. And so the basic idea of Glom is that we represent a parse tree by the relationship between these islands of agreement. So in transformers, we use agreement to actually activate neurons. Here we're going one step further, and we're using agreement as a method of representation. We're saying the fact that all those 6 black arrows at the object level agree is our way of representing that there's an object there, and it's the same object everywhere. You can think of that black arrow as a bit like a symbol, or it's a bit like a pointer, and it points to the object. But it's not an arbitrary pointer like you have in a conventional computer with random access memory. It's a pointer that does its work by providing input to a neural net. And the neural net, if you give it the representation of the whole face, will be able to compute those red arrows and those green arrows, namely the representations of the major parts of the face. So going back to the Glom architecture, you can think of at level L+1, you might have one of those black vectors. And if this location X that we're dealing with here is a location where the nose is, then we want the object level vector to produce a representation of the nose at level L. That's what that red arrow coming top down should do. It should take the face, and knowing what the pose of the face is relative to the camera, it should be able to figure out what the pose of the nose is relative to the camera. So it's doing a coordinate transform from the coordinate frame of the face to the coordinate frame of the nose, just like in those diagrams I showed you at the beginning for that ring of edges in a cube. Okay. Now there's a problem here, which is the face vector, when it's in a location where there's a nose, has to predict the nose. But we have the very same face vector in a location where there's a mouth. So in the location where there's a mouth, the at the object level, it's a face, and at the major part level, it's a mouth. And so how do we make the very same vector at the object level produce two different things at the part level? And that seems to be a problem, particularly if the top-down neural network is deterministic. You could try and make it stochastic, but you don't want it to be stochastic. You want it, if it's generating the part level representation for a location where the nose is, the face vector has to produce a nose. That is the embedding for a nose. And if it's trying to figure out what this part is where the mouth is, it has to produce a mouth. And it's the very same face vector that has to produce them both. So how can we do that? And the answer to that is what's sometimes called implicit functions, but would probably be better called neural fields. And the idea is that unlike something like an autoencoder network, where from a layer you try and produce the whole of the layer below, what we're going to do is at each location, we're going to take the face vector, that location, and we're trying to predict just the part of that location. So here's a very simple example of a neural field or implicit function, just to give you the basic idea. And I'm going to use very simple locations here, where each location is just a pixel. And let's suppose we have 4 pixels. And the way these pixels work is that the intensity of a pixel changes linearly as you go across the image. So the intensity of pixel X is given by AX plus B, where A and B are constants. So the intensity is a function of where you are. Just like for a face, the part you expect to see is a function of where you are in the face. Now we can make a little neural network that has exactly the same code for all pixels. The code is AB, and that's the same for all pixels. And provided we take the neural network and we give it an extra input, namely the location you're trying to predict, then the AB, when you give it the extra input x4, can predict the intensity of pixel 4. And AB, when you give it the extra input of x1, will predict the intensity of pixel 1. And all the neural net has to do is just apply that equation, f of x equals ax plus b. You give it the x, you give it the a and b, and it figures out what f of x is. So that's a very simple example of a neural field. These things have proved very effective for representing scenes with neural nets, and we're going to use them hierarchically in Glom. So the idea is, going back a bit, let's go back to the islands picture. When that black vector at the object level has to produce the red vectors, it's doing that in locations that it can figure out must be a nose. And it can figure out they must be a nose because the black vector knows where the face is in the image, that is relative to the camera. So it knows the location of the face relative to the camera. And in any one of those columns, it also knows the location of the column. You can think of that as an extra input to the neural net. So given the face and knowledge of where the face is in the image, and given knowledge of where this location is in the image, you can figure out which bit of the face you ought to be expressing at the part level, whether it should be the nose or whether it should be the mouth. Okay, this is a complicated point, and that's all I have time for on that point. And that slide is saying what I just said. Now, in order to make this system so that it forms islands, we need to train it. The whole system is going to be trained, right? It's going to learn everything from data. And an obvious way to train it is to show it images that have patches missing. This is how you train language models like BERT. You showed a sentence with a few words missing, and it has to fill in the missing words. So in the Glom architecture, the obvious way to train it, let's go back to the Glom architecture, would be you show it an image, and at every location you get something like this going on. It's interacting with neighboring locations. And after some time steps, like 10 time steps, you wanted to be able to reconstruct the image, filling in anything that was missing. So then you back propagate through this whole architecture so that it can fill in correctly. And you hope it's going to learn these hierarchical descriptions of objects to do that. But in addition to doing that, you can encourage it to form islands. And that's where contrastive learning comes in. So the islands are formed because at every level, the vector that you get at one location is trying to agree with similar vectors at nearby locations. So all the vectors that form part of a nose are trying to agree with one another, but they're not trying to agree with the vectors that form part of a mouth because they're sufficiently different that they decide that's not relevant to them. And they do that by using that very simple function. You take the level L embedding vector at location X, that's Lx, the level L embedding vector at location Y, that's Ly, and you just take their scalar product, you exponentiate it, and if that's big, you say that X ought to attend to Y and Y ought to attend to X. They ought to average their level L embeddings together. And that's what causes the islands to form. We can do deep end-to-end training, which is what I just described, of getting it to fill in missing parts of an image. But you can make that be more effective and make it better at forming islands by using contrastive learning, like in SimClear. And the way contrastive learning would work in Glom is this. At a given location, a neural net is making a prediction for the embedding at an adjacent level in the next layer. So level L is getting input from a top-down neural net, that was the red arrow, an input from a bottom-up neural net, that was the blue arrow, and we want to train those nets. And so the way that you train those nets is, each of those nets makes a prediction. You then average those predictions and you average together with the information coming from similar representations at nearby locations using an attention-weighted average. And then what you do is you say, we want the bottom-up and top-down neural nets to try and agree with the average. So they have their individual predictions, and we try and make their individual predictions agree with the general consensus coming from both the bottom down, the top down, and from other locations, not just that location. And so we can train those nets to agree, and that will cause it to be better at forming islands. And we've actually implemented a very simple version of that, and that works. Okay. Now, you might think it's very wasteful to have islands of identical vectors. I mean, what's the point of having all these neurons and having a bunch of neurons in one location doing exactly the same thing as a bunch of neurons in another location? And it looks wasteful after you've settled down, but there's two reasons it isn't wasteful. The first is, as the network is settling down, it has to decide which locations should have the same object and which locations should have the same part. And having all those different vectors available before they all become identical is very useful for doing the search for which vectors should be the same as which other vectors. So you need all that apparatus anyway for doing the search. And what it's really doing is it's creating clusters as it does that, as it does the search. And the other reason why it's not wasteful is as you go up through the levels, you want longer and longer range interactions. When you're finding a nostril, you only need to look nearby. When you're finding a nose, you need to look a bit further. When you're finding a whole face, you need to look at more distant locations. But of course, if you look at all the more distant locations, you're going to have an awful lot of computation to do. We'd like to keep the amount of computation roughly the same at each level. And the way you do that is by having sparse connectivity at the higher levels. Now, sparse connectivity is fine. It means you don't need to look at all the locations because at the object level, what you're expecting is quite big islands of identical vectors. And all you need to do is see one of those vectors to know what object's there. or at the level of major parts, you only need to see one of those vectors. So basically, you can use the fact that you get islands of identical vectors to allow you to only sample a few of the locations, because there's a lot of redundancy there. And so the apparent waste of having all this redundancy allows you to use sparseness. Okay. Now, this talk was about a very complicated system, only parts of which are implemented. I don't expect you to understand it all, but luckily there's a paper. I've now put the paper on archive. I hope I got that in this talk. Yeah, the paper is there. I'll put that slide up again in a minute. And really the talk is to encourage you to try and read that paper. So just to summarize, I explained 3 recent developments in neural networks. I explained them all very briefly and quickly. Transformers, which are very good for language, but now also very good for vision. SimClear, which is very good for doing unsupervised representation from images, learning representation from images without labels, and implicit functions on neural fields, which allow you to have representations that generate different things in different positions. I very quickly outlined how you could use those 3 ideas in Glom, and how you could use these islands of identical vectors as a representation of a parse tree. And not many people seem to be interested in the problem of how neural nets represent parse trees. There's people who don't believe in neural nets who say they can't, like Gary Marcus, and there's people who just don't worry about it. And then there's people who believe in hybrids, like Josh Tenenbaum, I think. Maybe Josh Tenenbaum is more sensible than that, who think that it's kind of a neural net at the bottom and then it's symbolic stuff on top. And so they'll leave the part-whole hierarchy to the symbolic stuff. I think it's all neural nets. And so I need to show how neural nets can represent parse trees. And this Glom system is my best bet about how to do that. Okay, I'm finished, and a lot of this won't have made sense, but hopefully you picked up some interesting ideas from parts of it. And I want to encourage you to read that long paper. And there's one piece of good news about the paper. It's 44 pages long, and it's only got 1 equation in it. And you've seen the equation already. It's all explained in words. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you, Professor. Number 1, and some of these are anonymous, some are named, so I won't name who's asked them. We built frameworks that can learn to recognize, predict, and perhaps think, reinforcement, etc. For example, reinforcement learning, and even learn to create, for example, GPT-3. What are we still missing to get to general intelligence or artificial general intelligence?
Oh, I think artificial general intelligence is a long way off. I disagree with a lot of it. I disagree with Demis Hassabis and Ilya Sutskever. I agree with Ilya about most things, but they think AGI is much closer than I think it is. They think it's maybe coming in the next 10 or 15 years, and I think it's going to be 50 years away. I think there's a huge amount people do that we can't model properly yet. I do believe that neural networks is going to be able to do all of it. So I don't think there's anything in principle that neural networks aren't going to be able to model. I just think we need a lot more technical ideas before we can do that. Now, I've been wrong before. So I thought that, for example, doing machine translation with neural nets, I thought that was a long way in the future. And that happened much, much faster than I expected. But it was much, much faster than anybody else expected to. So it's possible I'm wrong, but I think AGI is a long way off. And I think there's all the things we can do now are just a small part of human intelligence.
So a connected question, do you think AGI is even important in its pursuit, like to the extent that it relates to a life as it is right now? Because perhaps smaller subsets can be highly functional, almost resembling general intelligence, I mean, within frames, right? Within bounded contexts.
I have an analogy for this, which is, suppose you wanted to dig a ditch, maybe an irrigation ditch. You want to dig an irrigation ditch a mile long. And you have a choice between 2 machines to do it. One is an android, that looks like a person and can hold a conversation with you, and is quite agile and knows how to sort of walk over rough ground and can actually hold a shovel and can dig a ditch. Or you have a backhoe, and the backhoe's big and it's got proper tracks on that can go in mud, and it's much more powerful. Well, if you want to dig a ditch, a backhoe is better than an android. Suppose you want to take some money out of the bank. An automatic teller machine is actually what you want. An automatic teller machine is easier to deal with than a person once you've got used to it. So I think there'll be lots of intelligent devices for particular things. And I think this idea of a general purpose intelligent device, I think there's lots of things we need to do that don't need that.
Next question. There is a debate about whether we are neural or symbolic. It seems that while we are still learning, we seem to be able to be neural, but when learning is over and saturated, we seem to become symbolic. Is this correct? How do you see this hybrid nature of the mind?
Okay, I don't think there is a hybrid nature of the mind. I think there's the brain, and it's made of neurons, and it's the substrate for the mind. And so everything that the mind does is implemented with neurons. The idea that you should suddenly switch to some completely different way of doing things, I think is crazy. And that's what this talk is mainly about. So there's something that people identified as, people like Gary Marcus, for example, identified as symbolic, which is part-whole hierarchies. And they were part of classical AI. And the pictures I showed you, I drew those pictures in 1979 to explain to symbolic AI people what I meant about this cube. But what I'm trying to do is show you how a neural net, by using islands of agreement, could implement that stuff. And I think it can all be implemented in a neural net. I don't think there is an interface between neural and symbolic. If you look at this neural net that has a part-whole hierarchy, there's no interface between the neural and the symbolic. It's just a particular way of designing a neural net that uses islands of agreement to do its processing. And so I have an analogy I like. This is described at the end of the paper for the neurosymbolic. So people who believe in a kind of neurosymbolic interface, I think of them as, I like reasoning by analogy, and I think that's the main way we reason. And I have a nice analogy for them, which is, suppose that you spent 50 years trying to convince people who made motor cars that electric motors are better than gasoline engines. And after 50 years, these people who've been busy using gasoline engines finally agreed with you. They finally said, gee, electric motors are really neat. And here's what we're going to use them for. We're going to use them for injecting the gasoline into the engine. That's what I see neurosymbolic as. We finally solve all sorts of problems using neural nets. And what do the symbolic people want to do? They want to hang on to their old symbolic systems and just use neural nets as the front end and the back end of them. Okay.
Do you think quantum computing will become practical anytime soon? And if so, how will current paradigms in AI evolve with the advent of quantum computing? Will they just become better, or does it open up completely new ways of thinking about intelligence?
I don't think it's, I mean, it may open up all sorts of new ways of thinking about all sorts of things. I don't think it's required for intelligence. I don't think, for example, the brain is making use of quantum effects. Roger Penrose believes things like that, but I don't. He's very good at physics, but he's not an AI person. And so I don't think quantum computation is going to tell us much about how the brain works. And I think all the things we really want to do, we can do without that. It may turn out to be very powerful. I made a kind of decision some years ago that it wasn't going to become practical in my lifetime. So I was going to bet on it not becoming practical in my lifetime, and therefore I wasn't going to follow it. So I don't follow it. So I don't have any technical knowledge about it. And if you want to know about quantum computing, ask somebody else.
A slightly connected question. So you just said, for example, Roger Penrose believes in it and you don't. What is the importance of belief in the pursuit of, for example, paradigms in AI?
Oh, it's huge. I mean, the reason people work on things is because they believe them. You can't do your best work on something you don't really believe in. And for me, I always believed that the brain is what underlies thought and perception. And we need to figure out how the brain does that. And when people were saying, there's this separation between hardware and software, and you should think about the software, you shouldn't be thinking about the hardware, I always thought they were crazy, because the kind of hardware the brain is just not the kind of hardware you have in a von Neumann machine. And so you're going to end up doing computation quite differently, like these islands of agreement, for example. And so I always believed that we need to think about the actual neural net to understand how thought and perception work. And that's what's driven me. Other people, most other people, believed we don't need to bother about the hardware at all. Back in the 1960s, it was a sin to think about the hardware. You just had to think about what the programs were. Those people went on and did very interesting things with programs. But I think having strong beliefs is essential, but the beliefs better be based on good intuitions, and you better be willing to revise them. So just being dogmatic, there's a difference between having strong beliefs and being dogmatic. Strong beliefs drive you both to develop things that show your beliefs are right, but also to explore things that threaten your beliefs. And you should explore those things open to the possibility you're wrong. That's the difference between having strong beliefs and being dogmatic.
Absolutely. Something relevant to today's talk. Someone wants to know if Glom is useful in multiple use cases. Why inspired by human representation, and why not something which is more mathematical?
Well, it is actually fairly mathematical. All this stuff about coordinate transforms is also inspired by computer graphics. So if you take a computer graphics person and you say, could you show me that from another angle? They just show it to you from another angle. They don't say, oh, I can't show it to you from another angle because they didn't train from that viewpoint. Whereas if you take computer vision and you say, I want to see that from a very different point, they say, well, I haven't trained from that viewpoint, so I won't recognize things from that viewpoint. So a lot of the inspiration for Glom, particularly for the idea of using these coordinate transforms, does come from computer graphics, and that is based on mathematics. So it does have quite a lot of mathematical inspiration too.
There's a connected question. Can you talk a bit about strategies or plans to allow training for Gloms?
Okay, so the simple way to train it that ought to work is by doing image completion, so leaving out patches of images. But I really want to be able to train it without doing that. I'd like to be able to train it just by using contrastive learning like SimClear. And we haven't got that working yet. But in the end, I think the way people learn is by unsupervised learning. But what they learn by unsupervised learning is this part-whole hierarchy. And so developing a part-whole hierarchy using pure unsupervised learning is still a fairly open problem. And that's what I'd like to see in Glom.
A popular topic, I don't worry much about it, but I'll ask it anyways. Do you think there's a real risk that unregulated AI poses threats to humanity? And should AI deployment start to be regulated?
I certainly think autonomous weapons should be regulated, yes. I think autonomous weapons are very dangerous. I would hate to see autonomous weapons in the hands of someone like President Putin or President Putin's allies. And I think they're basically autonomous weapons, intelligent autonomous weapons, will enable rich countries to make war on poor countries without people dying. And it's their soldiers dying that limits them from doing it. So I think they're very scary.
What are the next frontiers for self-supervision after the success of contrastive learning techniques like SimClear in matching fully supervised approaches?
Okay, so that I can say more about. So SimClear is basically just matching one level of representation, and it's really matching the scene level. So it's saying, take any two patches from the same image, any two crops of the same image, I want them to give me very similar representations. And that's the correct thing to do if you want to be able to identify the scene from a patch of the scene. So you'll notice in my islands, the top level was the scene level, and at the top level, all of the vectors would be the same because they'd be the vector for that scene. That's what happens in neural fields at present. So a big development of methods like SimClear is instead of just having one level at which things should be the same, have multiple levels. So have at a large scale, things should be the same over the whole scene. At the object level, things should be the same over the whole object, and so on. So a hierarchical version of SimClear is exactly what Glom is.
So there's a question that asks, why are you inspired by, I mean, this goes back to belief, I guess, inspired by the human way of thinking. Why not different method that works better than human representation and overcome our limitations? I guess this is highly speculative, but I thought I'd ask.
I guess when I was a student in the 1970s, the brain was so much better at things like perception and motor control and reasoning than any computer that it seemed a good idea to think about how the brain did it. That's no longer true in the same way. Now we're getting to have machines that can do something like an exaflop. And once you can do an exaflop, you have comparable compute power to a human brain. And there may well be much better ways of using that much compute power than what we've evolved. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to say we may be able to make very intelligent systems that work in an utterly different way. But that wasn't my research agenda, because my research agenda started in the 70s when brains were much better than computers. My aim was to understand how brains did it. I think this issue comes up with things like backpropagation and the issue of whether brains can really do backpropagation. If you look at language models like GPT-3, that has about 1/5 of a trillion connections. And if you ask, how much brain has 1/5 of a trillion connections? And the answer is about 1/2 cubic millimeter. So when you look at a brain scan, one of the voxels in a brain scan has more weights in it than the whole of GPT-3. So now that's interesting, because it's kind of surprising that there's enough synapses in one voxel, that is 1 cubic millimeter of your brain, to be able to have this incredible model of huge amounts of structure in language. And it may well be because backpropagation is better at packing information into parameters than whatever the brain uses. The brain has a kind of different problem, which is we don't live for very long. That is, you only have about 10 billion fixations in your lifetime. But you have 100 trillion connections. And so the problem for the brain isn't how you pack a lot of knowledge into not many connections. It's the opposite problem of how you use not much experience to learn a lot, but you've got lots of connections. So it's quite conceivable that the brain doesn't use backpropagation. And the brain isn't as good at packing information into connections as backpropagation is.
And how might we find out if the brain does or does not?
We try our hardest to figure out how it's doing it.
Last few questions. We're almost out of time. Do you think capsule networks can be extended for capturing long-term temporal dependencies?
Well, let me say one thing about capsule networks. You can think of Glom as a development of capsule networks, where you make each capsule local to a column. So each of these embedding vectors for a particular level within a column is like a capsule, but it's a universal capsule. It's a capsule that, instead of being a relatively small vector, is quite a big vector and can represent any type of part, if it's the part level, can represent any type of part there. But it did develop out of capsule architectures by making the capsules be universal. And I haven't thought much about applying it to language. I'm mainly interested in vision. So I don't want to sort of speculate about whether it can really do very long range interactions in language. But I think it can do long range interactions in vision at a high level, because these are interactions between big islands which are identical over big regions.
So there's, in the audience are a lot of students and very interested and inspired by wanting to be in this field. So I'll ask just one or two questions before we wrap up on their behalf. One is, what do you think are the greatest factors limiting more widespread education in AI and deep learning?
I think you need a good basic education in things like probability and calculus and linear algebra. Those help a lot in doing deep learning. But basically, once you've got those, I think you're fine. I don't think you need a big computer. Having one GPU is very helpful, but I don't think it's limited access to hardware. I think it's basic quantitative education in things like calculus, linear algebra, and probability.
So if we were to extend that answer and provide people like a beginner's toolkit before they jumped into this field, would it just be exactly that, or would it be a little more than that?
It would probably be a bit more than that, but those three things would certainly be major ingredients.
And for a rank beginner, if they were to start learning, where would you propose they start? If they were already good at the basics, which I mean, most serious high school students are.
Well, I would propose they look on my webpage and look at the lectures I gave on Coursera, which are now on my webpage. They're not available on Coursera anymore, but they only go up to 2012. Almost all the lectures are there. And that's my best attempt to explain to someone who doesn't know anything about deep learning what it's all about.
Thank you, Professor. That's all we have. We've also exhausted our time.
Okay.
And hope that we can persuade you to come back for another lecture sometime. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye for now.